My name is Ben Burgis. I'm the author of Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left, and one of the four co-authors of Myth and Mayhem, a leftist critique of Jordan Peterson, along with Conrad Hamilton, Marion Trejo, and Matt McManus, with an introduction by Slavoj Žižek. Both of those are out from Zer0 Books. Also a columnist for Jacobin Magazine and Arc Digital Media. And if all that isn't enough for you, or if you just like the work that I do and want to support me, you can go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. And for the monthly cost of a milkshake at the 50s Nostalgia Diner in Pulp Fiction, you can get 2 bonus essays a week as a gesture of appreciation for that support. All right. So what I'd like to talk about today is some recent controversies involving the journalist Matt Taibbi, and also more recently the linguist and left-wing icon Noam Chomsky. Matt Taibbi is a journalist who I admire very much, who wrote a substack post called "The American Press is Destroying Itself," and he says some things in it that I agree with. He says some things that I disagree with. Talk a little bit about which are which. But what's ultimately going to interest me even more here is a more recent wrinkle on it, which happened when journalist Zaid Jilani, which tells you something about how little I know about this person, that it took me for a second to remember the name, who contacted Noam Chomsky, who is extraordinarily good, much better than I am at answering his emails, to ask what he thought about Taibbi's piece and the larger question of intra-left controversies about free speech. So start with Taibbi's piece. Taibbi talks about a series of controversies. One of the main ones he's talking about is about Li Fang from The Intercept, and another one has to do with the New York Times decision to publish a deranged fascist editorial by Tom Cotton, and the subsequent controversy about that. So let's start with what I think Taibbi gets right. The first thing, by the way, is that Taibbi is just an extremely entertaining writer. So something he says in passing, it's not even about the subject of the article, at the beginning is, "Our president, Donald Trump, is a clown who makes a great reality show villain, but is uniquely toolless as leader of a superpower nation. Watching him try to think through 2 society imperiling crises is like waiting for a gerbil to solve Fermat's theorem," which, it's a good line. Taibbi can drop good lines in his sleep. But what he's really going on to talk about is a series of controversies involving liberals in some cases, leftists in others. One of my criticisms of the article actually is that Taibbi doesn't distinguish very much between those 2 categories, arguing amongst themselves about what the limits should be on what you can publish in a New York Times op-ed, what you can, what somebody should be able to say as a journalist working for a progressive outlet like The Intercept. And as I say, some of these are about controversies among people who have political positions that are broadly speaking to the left of liberalism, which is certainly what I mean when I use words like leftists. And some of them are about people who are liberals, if that, right? This sort of like centrist neoliberal empty suits who work for the New York Times. And again, I do think one of the things Taibbi gets wrong is failing to really make that distinction. Using the left to talk about both groups, which is one of the things. There's a response article from my friend Nathan Robinson at Current Affairs, where he's critical of Taibbi's article, and I thought Taibbi was right about some things. I thought Nathan was right about some things, but one of the things I did think Nathan really nailed him on was the question of that distinction. Similarly, I think he says at one point in the article, Taibbi says there were few press after talking about what he sees as various failures of the press, some of which I absolutely think are failures of the press. He says there were no press calls for self-audits after these episodes, just as there won't be a few weeks from now if COVID-19 cases spike after the protests, is what he means, or a few months from now if Donald Trump wins re-election, successfully painting the Democrats as supporters of violent protests who want to abolish the police. No, press activism is limited to denouncing and shaming colleagues for insufficient fealty to the cheap knockoff bullying campus Marxism that passes for leftist thought these days. And the idea that any of the things he's objecting to, some of which are very real in that article, have anything to do with Marxism is, I think, definitely one of the biggest failings of the article, that I just don't see any connection whatsoever there. In fact, I think that the people on the left who are the most likely to see the perils of this kind of vampire castle-y way of conducting intra-left controversies that Taibbi is rightly objecting to, referring there, of course, to the great late Mark Fisher's classic essay, Exiting the Vampire Castle, which I'd recommend everybody read. The people most likely to object to that nonsense on the left are Marxists. So again, I don't think that part was tightly argued. Some of the examples that Taibbi uses, I think whether you get into the details of those examples, some of them are better than others. But I think that the larger subject is, has there been a shift on the left, broadly speaking, and even if we are making this distinction, which I think is really important to make, between liberals and leftists, I'd still say that there isn't always a sharp distinction between the two in practice, and that's actually part of the problem, right? That's one of the reasons that some things that I'd like to think of as just pathologies of liberalism do spill over into the left in troubling ways. And certainly some of the pathologies of liberalism that have been on display lately, without even commenting necessarily one way or the other about the he said, she said of some of Taibbi's examples, I'll just mention a couple that different people that I know personally have brought to my attention in conversations about it. Both of these people are good leftists, socialists who are involved in podcasts. I guess that narrows it down enough. You can probably guess, but I'm not talking about not the two or three most prominent names you might be thinking of, but people who are in that world. So one of these examples was somebody who sent me some screenshots from his neighborhood Facebook group, where people were getting furious at the owner of a local beer bar because he hadn't made a statement of solidarity with the protests and talked about Black Lives Matter. I also hadn't made any statements at all in recent months. The last Facebook post from this bar was when they shut down dine-in service. I think they're still selling bottles through the window or something months ago. So That's one example. Another example was from somebody who has a, is a self-employed small business person in his day job, who other people he knows in this world, right, doesn't normally talk about politics with, were mad at him because he hadn't, made some sort of, of statement of racism is bad and protests are good, etc. In his capacity as a self-employed person in this field, and he pointed out, to the people who were getting mad at him about this, that he's actually been protesting for racial justice and against police brutality for years and years and years, and they were very unimpressed by that, right? So what's going on with examples like this? And I think that's maybe a bigger subject for another video, but just as a preview of coming attractions, I think part of what's going on is that a lot of people with good progressive impulses are, at this point, I think maybe don't have a lot of confidence when you get right down to it that they can change deeply entrenched state institutions like policing. So given what they see as the very limited horizons of what they can really accomplish in the wider world, they go hunting for easier victories closer to home, involving just bizarre things like canceling the guy who owns the coffee shop down the street because he hasn't gone through the public relations exercise of indicating his support for the protests and his opposition to racism and police brutality, which would be a reasonable thing to get mad at somebody like me who comments publicly about politics on a regular basis for, if I hadn't, but be a bizarre thing to get upset about here. And I think this sort of, okay, who's everybody in my sphere that I can do something about, who I can bully for not having, said all the right things, which would do nobody any good whatsoever in the real world. I think it's very easy to see how this can get turned in some cases to an atmosphere of witch hunting moralism. And whatever you think about some of the specific examples in the piece, I think there have been real cases of that. And real cases not just among liberals, but on the left. The cancellation of Adolph Reed by the New York branch of DSA, which I talked about a couple of weeks ago on this channel, would be, I think, a very obvious example of that same sort of impulse towards handling intra-left disagreements in extremely unhealthy ways that show off some of these same dynamics. And whatever you think about, the Li Fang controversy or the New York Times controversy, and obviously I have nothing but contempt for Cotton, but exactly what the range of views should be in the New York Times, is a more complicated issue. I'd be able to swallow the Cotton thing a little bit more easily if there were more strident lefty pieces of certain kinds, and we could argue about, they published this, or they published that, but would they publish this? Would we publish that? You can get into that rabbit hole. I'm not really interested in doing that. But in any case, whatever you think about those specific details, I think it is, broadly speaking, the case that both of these are true. That historically, the left has cared a great deal about free speech, not just as a legal institution, but as a value. That, we want a kind of society where ordinary people are asked to decide a lot more things for themselves than they are in this kind of society. And it's very natural as part of that commitment to like there to be a very broad range of views that people can, make up their own minds about. And that obviously, this is not a uniform thing that everybody on the left has always cared about free speech as much as they should, right? I mean, Stalinism exists. But broadly speaking, this has been a left-wing concern, right? Norman Thomas from the Socialist Party was one of the founders of the ACLU before it was even called the ACLU. Think about the free speech movement in Berkeley in the 60s. So, this has been a long-standing site of leftist concern. And some of these controversies might reasonably make some folks think that that much of the left doesn't currently place the kind of value on free speech that historically leftists had and that leftists should, for all the reasons that I've just said. Somebody who was recently asked for his opinion about all this was Noam Chomsky, who, of course, is, I think, about as close there is to a saint in my cosmology. He could have just rested on his laurels of being the most important linguist in the 20th century and helping to revolutionize that field and help to give birth to contemporary cognitive science, etc. But instead, he's spent the last several decades speaking out about U.S. imperialism and Palestine and etc. And he's a figure who a lot of leftists are interested in what he has to say. Both people like me who deeply admire him, and also people like, mostly some strange tankies, but also people who are angered at some of his positions on tactical voting and other things, who can't stand him, right? But both of those groups, the people who like him and the people who can't stand him, are interested in finding out what he thinks about things, right? If you're that invested one way or the other. So I didn't think it was that strange when Zaid Jilani emailed Chomsky to ask him both what he thinks about whether there has been this larger left shift on free speech issues, and specifically what he thought about the Matt Taibbi article. Now, if Jilani posted the screenshots of Chomsky's responses, which were characteristically terse, it was like a sentence or two, which is how he generally, I understand, responds to emails. Again, the fact that he does respond to all these emails is amazing in itself. But if he was making what was understood as private correspondence public, then I could see that being a problem. As I understand it, from the subsequent Twitter exchange, Jilani says he's, contacted Chomsky about various things many times before, and Chomsky knows who he is, so he understands this is a journalist asking him for comment for use in pieces, not just a random fan who's curious about what Chomsky thinks, in which case the screenshots will be a little bit better. But the main objection that I saw people make to this online, and I saw about 10,000 people make this, was, oh my God, I can't believe that, you're appealing to Noam Chomsky to settle some Twitter argument. So that itself, that objection, and obviously a lot of people were just having fun and joking around, and the least funny thing you can do to a joke is break it down to its component parts, but I'm going to do that anyway, right? There were all kinds of jokes about, I don't know, asking Chomsky if, he agrees with me about, whether Coldplay sucks or, whatever. I don't know exactly. That's probably an example that dates me. But I think the objection buried in all of those jokes logically detaches into two separate pieces. So one of those, which is, I think, the more interesting of the two, is this idea that that Jilani was guilty of something like appeal to authority, that he was, calling in Chomsky to be like a referee about what he was arguing with people on Twitter about, like he's the Pope of leftism or something, and that would obviously be ridiculous. The other is the idea that, Chomsky is this nice kind of out of it old man, and you're and you're asking him about all this Twitter stuff that he wouldn't know anything about, and it's just a inherently absurd exercise, right? Like that you're you're asking old man Chomsky to weigh in on Twitter drama. What are you doing here? Okay, let's start with the second and maybe less interesting one. I think this is more easily dispatched. Because Chomsky has been taking an interest in intra-left disagreements about the limits of free speech for decades. He's been in the hot seat of free speech controversies himself. Most famously, one involving a French Holocaust denier, Robert Faurisson. I'm probably mangling that. My French pronunciation has always sucked. As people who went to grad school with me can attest. Chomsky, of course, as a extremely left-wing Jewish person, is no friend to Holocaust denial. But he was concerned with this French academic, Faurisson, who is a Holocaust denier, was put on trial for incitement to racial hatred, for promoting Holocaust denial, for I think he'd written a couple of letters to a French newspaper questioning the logistical details of how the gas chambers worked or something like that. And Chomsky had put out a bland but necessary statement about the importance of free speech, which Faurisson then, without Chomsky's foreknowledge or permission, included as the preface to a book that he'd written. And then people were mad at Chomsky for supporting the free speech rights of this terrible bigot, which of course, Faurisson clearly is a terrible bigot, right? But the whole idea, right, Chomsky's whole point, is that it's not interesting to support free speech for people you agree with. The real action is going to be, right, what's really going to show whether you're committed to free speech or not is about people you disagree with. And Faurisson wasn't sent to prison, but he was given a 3-month suspended prison term and a big fine. And Chomsky, given his principles, predictably thought that was very bad. Now, none of the current controversies involve anything on that level. But even so, given his history of taking an interest in these issues, I think asking a prominent leftist who has a long-standing interest in intra-left controversies about the limits of free speech what he thinks about a widely discussed article by a famous journalist about intra-left controversies about the limits of free speech seems pretty reasonable to me. It seems like this is not bothering old man Chomsky about some, newfangled Twitter thing he wouldn't understand, right? That seems like the wrong conceptual category to put that in. All right. But Jilani's action of asking Chomsky and then tweeting about the answer could be objectionable on other grounds. You could think that he's engaged in something like the appeal to authority fallacies. He's treating Chomsky as if he's the infallible pope of Marxism. And I don't know, because I don't know Jilani. I don't even really know his work. And even if I did, it could be very hard. Like I'm pretty dubious about critiques that seem to rely on mind reading, what's somebody's innermost intention, when they publicize something like this. But if he did intend it that way, then sure, fair enough. That's bad. I don't know if he did or not. But that said, I do think that Chomsky's opinions on these matters, he said he thought the Taibbi article was insightful, and he agrees that there's been a disturbing shift in left attitudes on free speech. I do think that Chomsky's views on these matters are a matter of interest. I'm glad we know his answers because I think it's interesting and newsworthy. And so really, I think maybe the more interesting question is whether I'm guilty of something like the appeal to authority fallacy for finding this interesting and newsworthy. I don't think so. But I could see how somebody might come to that conclusion, right? So I guess in the last minute or two of the video, I'm just going to, I think, defend what I think the distinction is. So if you assume that Chomsky has no special knowledge about this, or or even special moral or political insight that the rest of us lack, but you're still appealing to what he thinks to settle the issue, that may very well commit the appeal to authority fallacy. But this also gets us into larger issues about what's sometimes called epistemic peer disagreement. So epistemology is the branch of philosophy that has to do with knowledge and evidence and all that good stuff. So epistemic peer disagreement is the name of the area of philosophical controversy about what reasonable, rational people should do when we find out that somebody who's an epistemic peer, in other words, they have access to the same evidence that we do, they're just as good at reasoning as we are, what we should do when an epistemic peer comes to a different conclusion than us. And one of the most extreme views, which I certainly don't agree with, is that when you find out that you're in this position that an epistemic peer disagrees with your conclusion, you should just give up your current beliefs and, I guess just remain agnostic about the question. That, in that case, who knows, right? Just throw up your hands. But a more moderate version of the position says, well, you don't necessarily have to give up your beliefs when you find out that an epistemic peer disagrees with you, but it should give you pause. Maybe to be a total logic nerd about this, you should revise your degree of belief downward, right? That if I was 90% sure before I found out that an epistemic peer disagreed, maybe I should only be 85% sure now. And that seems a bit more reasonable. There are big, complicated questions about how far we should take that, whether we should always be less confident when we find out that we're in the presence of epistemic peer disagreement, who counts as an epistemic peer, how you find out that somebody counts as an epistemic peer, how could I be sure, for example, could be that, if, Nathan Robinson, you read Matt Taibbi's article and you looked into all of his examples and you decided, like Nathan did, that you think he's wrong about the examples, you might just think, okay, I really admire Chomsky and, I think he's a very insightful guy, but maybe he doesn't have access to all the same evidence that I do. Maybe he just didn't look into it very carefully. But I think given the premise that what people whose reasoning abilities we respect and who we generally assume has access to similar levels of evidence that we do, that what conclusions they come to should at least be a point of interest for us in our reasoning about these things, that we should see, that maybe if somebody, and I think we all do this, right? Different people, because we have different ideas about who's in this category, right? But I could certainly list off people who, if my friend Michael Brooks is in this category for me, right? If I find out that Michael, has a take on something that is totally different from mine, I don't automatically agree with him, right? We've disagreed about plenty of things, in the years we've known each other, and, but that would give me a second of pause because I think he's a very smart and insightful guy. So I wonder if I got this wrong, right? And then I'd have to think about it. And I might still conclude, I think, I think he's full of shit on this one, right? I would carefully consider that, right? So I think that if you don't think it's totally illegitimate to take into account as evidence the fact that someone you think is smart and insightful and has generally good values comes to a certain conclusion as you're trying to figure out what you think about the issue, then I think Chomsky being concerned about some of the issues Taibbi raised is relevant. That's okay, right? You're not committing any fallacies when you think it's relevant, whether you agree with him or not. Obviously, I'm more sympathetic to the Chomsky side of the argument than I am to the people who make jokes about frozen peaches when they hear the phrase free speech. But, what conclusion you come to, that's a different question. But go ahead and ask Chomsky what he thinks. He's a really smart guy and he's deeply committed to the same things we are. It's worth finding out.